The morning sun filtered through the slightly dusty windows of May's diner, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. In the corner booth, where the morning light hit just right, sat Harold Matthews. At 93 years old, his routine was as much a part of the diner as the old jukebox that hadn't worked since 1995. Every morning, without fail, Harold would arrive at exactly 7:15 a.m. The bell above the door would chime, and May herself would already be reaching for the coffee pot before he'd even settled into his seat. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, would carefully arrange his napkin and silverware just so, a habit left over from his military days. "The usual, Harold?" May would ask, even though she'd already told the cook to start his scrambled eggs and toast. Harold would smile, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening, and nod. It was a dance they'd perfected over 15 years of mornings. Today was no different. Harold sat in his corner booth, his Korean War veteran's cap placed carefully on the table beside him. The cap, like Harold, had seen better days, but it was clean and well maintained, the embroidered military insignia still bright against the faded blue fabric. His breakfast arrived right on schedule: 2 scrambled eggs, not too dry, 3 strips of crispy bacon, and 2 pieces of wheat toast with a small pot of strawberry jam on the side. The other regulars at May's knew Harold's routine too. Sarah, the young waitress who worked morning shifts to put herself through community college, always made sure his coffee cup never went empty. Old Bill from the hardware store would tip his hat as he passed Harold's booth, and sometimes they'd exchange quiet words about the weather or the local high school football team's latest game. Harold had just started spreading jam on his toast when he noticed something odd. The familiar morning chatter in the diner had suddenly gone quiet. Then he felt it, a low rumble in the ground, growing stronger by the second. The coffee in his cup started to ripple, like tiny waves in a miniature ocean. Through the window, shadows fell across his table as several large motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot. Not just any motorcycles. These were custom choppers, chrome gleaming in the morning sun, their engines growling like angry beasts. Harold counted 5 of them, then 8, then 12. They kept coming, filling up the small parking lot in a way that seemed deliberate, aggressive even. May appeared at his table, coffee pot in hand, but her usual cheerful smile had been replaced with a worried frown. "Never seen that bunch before," she murmured, topping off his cup. "Don't look like the usual riding clubs that pass through." Harold watched as the bikers dismounted. They were a rough-looking bunch, all leather and denim, covered in patches and tattoos. But it wasn't their appearance that caught his attention. It was the way they moved, the way they spread out across the parking lot. In his long military career, Harold had learned to read people, to spot the difference between show and substance. These men were putting on a display, like peacocks strutting, but with an undercurrent of meanness to it. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it wasn't the friendly tinkle that announced the arrival of a regular customer. The door was pushed open with such force that it slammed against the wall, making the windows rattle. The sound echoed through the now silent diner. Harold didn't turn to look. Instead, he calmly took a sip of his coffee and continued spreading jam on his toast. He could feel the vibration of heavy boots on the floor, smell the mixture of leather and motorcycle exhaust that now filled the air. 15 years of peaceful mornings at May's Diner had just come to an end. The other customers seemed to shrink in their seats, trying to make themselves invisible. May stood behind the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the coffee pot. Sarah had stopped mid-step, a plate of pancakes trembling slightly in her hands. Only Harold remained unchanged, methodically finishing his breakfast preparation as if nothing unusual was happening. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind was already working, assessing, planning, old habits from a life these bikers knew nothing about. Not yet, anyway. The bikers claimed the entire back section of May's Diner as their territory that first morning. They pushed tables together roughly, the scraping sound making everyone wince. Their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, deliberately chose the table closest to Harold's corner booth. The message was clear. They were marking their territory. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them called out, his voice carrying the fake sweetness of mock politeness. "Ain't you sitting in our spot?" A few of his companions snickered, the sound ugly in the usually peaceful diner. Harold took another bite of his eggs, chewing slowly and deliberately. He'd survived 3 years in Korea, including that terrible winter at Chosin Reservoir. These boys, with their loud voices and obvious attempts at intimidation, didn't rattle him one bit. The next morning, Harold arrived at his usual time, 7:15 a.m. sharp. But this time, the road warriors were already there, their motorcycles taking up multiple parking spaces each. Inside, they had spread themselves out even more, leaving only the counter seats free. Harold's corner booth was occupied by 3 of them, who watched him enter with predatory grins. May hurried over to him, wringing her hands in her apron. "Harold, I'm so sorry. I tried to save your spot. But they..." Her voice trailed off as she glanced nervously at the bikers. "The counter's fine, May," Harold said quietly, patting her arm. He settled onto a counter stool, his movements careful but dignified. Behind him, you could hear the bikers laughing, making exaggerated old man noises and jokes about adult diapers. This became the new normal at May's Diner. The road warriors would arrive early, taking up as much space as possible. They seemed to take special pleasure in making Harold's morning routine difficult. They would bump his chair as they passed, accidentally jostle his arm while he was trying to drink his coffee, or make loud comments about retirement homes having better food. Sarah, the young waitress, tried her best to protect Harold. She'd stand between him and the bikers while refilling his coffee, her young face set in determined lines. But even she couldn't stop them from their constant harassment. "Don't you worry about me, Sarah," Harold told her one morning after a biker had deliberately spilled his orange juice. "I've dealt with worse than schoolyard bullies in my time." The road warriors grew bolder as the days passed. They started blocking Harold's old Buick in the parking lot, forcing him to wait until they finished their meals before he could leave. They would flick cigarette ashes near his food when Ma wasn't looking. One of them even started wearing a mock veteran's cap, tilted at a disrespectful angle. Other customers started avoiding the diner during breakfast hours. The morning regulars, Old Bill from the hardware store, Mrs. Peterson who always ordered dry toast and tea, the Johnson twins who stopped in before their shift at the factory, they'd all found other places to eat. But Harold kept coming back, every single morning. May tried to reason with the bikers once. "Harold's been coming here for 15 years, she told their leader, her voice shaking but determined. "He's a war veteran, for heaven's sake, show some respect." The man with the snake tattoo just laughed. "Respect. Lady, respect is earned in this world. And all I see is an old man taking up space that belongs to us now." Through it all, Harold maintained his dignity. He never complained, never reported them to the police, never raised his voice. He simply adjusted his routine, ate his breakfast at the counter, and went about his day. But those who knew him well, like May and Sarah, noticed the subtle changes. How his shoulders tensed when the motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot, how his hand shook slightly when lifting his coffee cup, how the warm spark in his eyes had dimmed just a little. What the road warriors didn't realize was that Harold's calm exterior masked decades of combat experience and leadership. Each morning, as he sat at the counter enduring their taunts, he was watching them, learning their patterns, assessing their weaknesses. Like a chess master, he was patiently waiting for the right moment to make his move. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected. The autumn morning air was crisp when Harold pulled into May's Diner parking lot, only to find his car immediately surrounded by 5 motorcycles. The road warriors had grown bolder over the past few weeks, their numbers swelling from 12 to nearly 20. Their bikes now dominated the small parking lot like metal predators circling their prey. Snake, their leader, had taken to sitting at the counter right next to Harold's usual spot. His leather vest was covered in new patches, each one seeming to tell a story of some act of intimidation or violence. The snake tattoo on his neck would appear to move when he turned his head to stare at Harold, its forked tongue flickering near his ear. "Look who's still alive," Snake called out as Harold entered the diner. "Thought maybe you'd finally checked into that retirement home we recommended." The other bikers laughed on cue, like a pack of hyenas responding to their leader's call. Harold's hands trembled more noticeably now as he reached for his coffee cup, but not from fear. The tremors came from holding back his anger, from maintaining the control that had served him well through decades of military service. He watched in the mirror behind the counter as 2 younger bikers mocked his movements, their exaggerated shaking hands spilling coffee deliberately on the floor. May had grown thinner with worry. The stress of watching her beloved diner turn into a place of daily torment showed in the new lines around her eyes. The morning's receipts had dropped by half since the road warriors claimed the place as their territory. Even the lunch and dinner crowds were smaller now, the town's residents too intimidated to eat where the bikers might show up. "I'm so sorry, Harold," May whispered one morning, her voice catching as she poured his coffee. Maybe, maybe it would be better if you found somewhere else for breakfast. Just until they move on." Her eyes were red from crying, though she tried to hide it. "They won't move on, May," Harold replied softly. "Bullies never do unless someone stands up to them." His voice carried the weight of experience, of battles fought long ago on foreign soil. The harassment grew more personal. The bikers discovered Harold's car was a restored 1957 Buick that he'd owned since his military days. One morning, he found it surrounded by motorcycles parked so close he couldn't open the doors. Another day, he discovered crushed cigarette butts on the hood and seat cushion stuffing scattered around the tires. Sarah, the young waitress, tried to document the harassment with her phone camera, but one of the bikers caught her. He didn't touch her, but the way he looked at her phone and then at her made the threat clear. She stopped bringing her phone to work after that, but her hands shook every time she had to serve the bikers' table. The local sheriff, Tom Wilson, finally came by after receiving multiple complaints from other customers. He stood at the counter, thumbs hooked in his belt, and had a quiet word with Snake. But everyone could see the sheriff's discomfort when 5 more bikers walked in during their conversation, their leather vests displaying patches from motorcycle clubs known for violence. "Ain't no law against having breakfast," Snake said loudly after the sheriff left. "Right, old-timer?" He clapped Harold on the shoulder hard enough to make him spill his coffee. Harold carefully wiped up the spilled coffee with a napkin. His movements were precise, controlled, just like when he used to field strip his rifle in the Korean winter. Each morning, he studied the bikers' interactions, noting which ones were true believers in their intimidation tactics and which ones just followed along. He observed their hierarchies, their patterns, their weaknesses. The breaking point came when they started mocking his veteran's cap. It wasn't the disrespect to him that bothered Harold. He'd endured worse. It was when they started talking about veterans in general, making crude jokes about PTSD and questioning the courage of soldiers they'd never met. Harold's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. In the mirror behind the counter, his reflection showed a change coming over his face. The tired eyes of an elderly man were replaced by something else, something that would have made the bikers pause if they'd been paying attention. It was the look of a commander who had made a decision. The time for patience was over. Word about the bikers' treatment of Harold spread through Miller's Creek like wildfire. At the grocery store, the post office, and especially at Chuck's barbershop, people talked in worried whispers about the situation at May's Diner. The town of 3,000 had never faced anything like this before. Chuck's barbershop became the unofficial meeting place for concerned citizens. As he trimmed hair and shaved beards, Chuck listened to everyone's opinions about what should be done. Old Bill from the hardware store wanted to organize a group of men to stand up to the bikers. Mrs. Peterson suggested calling the state police. The Johnson twins thought about reaching out to a motorcycle club they knew in the next county. "Did you hear what they did to Harold's car yesterday?" Chuck asked while cutting Mayor Thompson's hair. "Wrote nasty things in the dust on his windows and left cigarette burns on the seats. That Buick's been his pride and joy since Korea." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in the barber's chair. "Tom Wilson says his hands are tied. The bikers aren't technically breaking any laws that would stick in court, just a lot of small things that add up." Harold's grandson, Michael, a local high school teacher, visited his grandfather more frequently now. He would arrive at the diner just as Harold was finishing his breakfast, trying to make sure the old veteran got safely to his car. The bikers seemed to take special pleasure in intimidating the younger man, making comments about teaching and schoolboys whenever he appeared. "Grandpa, please," Michael begged one morning after walking Harold to his car. "You can have breakfast at my place. Jenny's a great cook, and the kids would love to see you every morning." His voice cracked with worry. Harold patted his grandson's arm. "Son, I've been coming to May's for 15 years. Your grandmother and I had our last breakfast together here before she passed. Some things are worth standing up for." The situation affected local businesses too. The hardware store across from May's Diner saw its morning customers disappear. The small bookshop next door closed 2 hours early because the owner was afraid to walk to her car after dark. Even the bank on the corner posted a security guard during business hours. Sarah, the young waitress, started losing college students who used to study at the diner. The tips that helped pay for her community college classes dried up as regular customers stayed away. Still, she refused to quit, feeling she couldn't abandon May and Harold. "My dad served in Desert Storm," she told her worried mother. "He always said you don't leave people behind. Harold and May need me here." One evening, Pastor Roberts from the First Baptist Church tried to mediate. He walked into the diner during the bikers' usual dinner time and asked to speak with their leader. Snake listened with an amused smile as the pastor talked about community harmony and Christian values. "Tell you what, preacher," Snake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Why don't you stick to saving souls on Sunday, and we'll handle things our way the rest of the week?" The other bikers laughed, and the pastor left with slumped shoulders. The town's children started avoiding the street where May's diner stood. Parents warned them not to go near the bikers, creating new routes for them to walk to school. The once busy sidewalk in front of the diner became strangely empty, except for the leather-clad figures lounging outside. Harold watched all of this from his counter seat each morning. He saw how the town's fear grew, how people crossed the street to avoid walking past the diner, how the community he'd known for decades was changing. His quiet dignity in the face of harassment had inspired respect, but also a deep sense of helplessness among the townspeople. Late one night, May sat in her empty diner crying over the books. Half her customers were gone, and she was barely making enough to cover expenses. The thought of closing the diner her parents had started 40 years ago was almost unbearable. She didn't hear the back door open, didn't know Harold had used his spare key until he was standing beside her. "Ma," he said softly, his weathered hand resting on her shoulder. "I think it's time we did something about this situation." There was something in his voice she'd never heard before, a tone of command that made her look up in surprise. The next morning would change everything in Miller's Creek, but not in the way anyone expected. The morning started like any other at May's diner, with the same tension that had become normal over the past weeks. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 7:15 a.m. as Harold entered, his veteran's cap placed firmly on his head. The cap seemed to sit differently today, its military insignia catching the early morning light. Snake and his road warriors had arrived early, as usual, their motorcycles taking up most of the parking lot. The air inside the diner was thick with cigarette smoke, despite May's no smoking signs. Sarah moved carefully between tables, trying to avoid the bikers' deliberate attempts to trip her as she served their breakfast. Harold took his usual spot at the counter, carefully arranging his napkin and silverware. May poured his coffee without a word, but her hands were shaking more than usual. She'd been up most of the night worrying about the diner's future, and dark circles showed under her eyes. "Getting a bit crowded in here, isn't it?" Snake called out, louder than necessary. He stood up from his booth, stretching deliberately to show off the snake tattoo coiling around his neck. "Maybe it's time we helped Gramps find a new breakfast spot." Several of his gang members chuckled, the sound ugly in the morning quiet. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Snake walked over to Harold's spot at the counter, deliberately bumping into other customers' tables along the way. He reached for Harold's coffee cup, picked it up, and poured the hot liquid directly into the veteran's lap. The diner went completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic noise from outside seemed to fade away. Sarah dropped her serving tray, the crash of plates against the floor echoing through the stunned silence. May's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. But it wasn't the coffee that made Harold stand up slowly from his counter stool. No, it was what Snake did next. With a sneer, he reached for Harold's veteran's cap, snatching it off his head. "Let's see how tough this old-timer really is," Snake taunted, dangling the cap just out of reach. Harold stood perfectly still. His pants were soaked with coffee, but he showed no sign of discomfort. Instead, something changed in his posture. The slight stoop of age disappeared, replaced by the straight-backed stance of a military officer. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, turned hard as steel. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying an authority that made several of the younger bikers straighten unconsciously in their seats. "I'm going to give you one chance to return my property and apologize." Snake laughed, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. Something about Harold's voice, his bearing, had changed. The old man before him suddenly didn't seem so old anymore. "Or what, Grandpa? You'll tell us another war story?" Harold's next words cut through the air like a knife. "No, son, I'm going to tell you who I really am." His voice had taken on a tone of command that made even Snake take a small step backward. "And then you're going to understand just how badly you've miscalculated this situation." The diner had become so quiet you could hear the coffee dripping from the counter onto the floor. Every eye was fixed on Harold. May had never seen him like this. Gone was the quiet, gentle, regular customer. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone who radiated authority and power. Snake tried to maintain his swagger, but his gang members could see him faltering. The old man's transformation was unsettling. Some of the younger bikers were already edging away from their leader, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "You want to know who I am?" Harold asked, his voice now carrying to every corner of the diner. The morning sun through the windows cast his shadow long across the floor, making him appear larger than life. "Well, let me educate you about respect, honor, and the mistake you've been making these past weeks." Harold reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The movement made several bikers tense up, but what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was an old, worn leather wallet. As he opened it, something metal gleamed inside, something that would change everything in the next few moments. Harold opened the worn leather wallet with steady hands, his movements deliberate and calm. The morning sunlight caught something metallic inside, a gleaming badge that made one of the younger bikers near the door suddenly inhale sharply. But it wasn't just any badge that Harold removed from his wallet. Along with it came a set of black and white photographs, worn at the edges but carefully preserved. "Before I show you these," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from decades of command, "let me introduce myself properly. I'm Colonel Harold Matthews, former commander of the Marine Force Recon Unit during the Korean War." A murmur ran through the group of bikers. Two of them, veterans themselves, exchanged worried glances. The name meant something to them. "But that's not all," Harold continued, laying the first photograph on the counter. It showed a younger version of himself, standing proudly next to a customized Harley-Davidson motorcycle. He wore leather riding gear, and behind him stood hundreds of other riders. This was taken in 1975, at the first national meeting of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. Snake's face had lost some of its color. The Veterans Motorcycle Alliance was legendary in biker circles, the largest and most respected military motorcycle club in the country. Even the toughest outlaw bikers knew not to cross them. "You see," Harold went on, his voice steady as he laid down another photograph, "I didn't just join the alliance. I founded it. I was its first national president." The second photo showed Harold receiving an award from a Marine Corps general, with a newspaper headline visible. "Veteran Biker Group Sets New Standard for Community Service." The diner had gone completely still. Sarah had stopped cleaning up the broken plates. May stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot suspended in midair. Even the traffic outside seemed to have quieted. "We started the alliance because we saw how motorcycle clubs were being formed for the wrong reasons," Harold explained, his voice taking on a teacher's tone. "We wanted to show that bikers could be a force for good in their communities, that the brotherhood of riders could mean something more than intimidation and fear." He laid down a third photograph, this one more recent, showing him at a massive motorcycle rally, surrounded by respectful younger riders. "For 30 years, I led the largest veterans riding organization in America. We built homes for disabled vets, established scholarship funds for military families, and created a network of support that spans all 50 states." Snake still held Harold's veteran's cap, but his grip had loosened. Some of his younger followers had already started backing away, creating distance between themselves and their leader. "That badge you see here?" Harold picked up the metal object that at first caught everyone's attention. "This is the Alliance's highest honor. Only 12 have ever been awarded. It represents a lifetime of service, both to our country and to the biker community." Harold's voice took on a harder edge as he continued. "I've spent the last few weeks watching you boys, watching how you treat people, watching you dishonor everything that real bikers stand for. I wanted to see if any of you had the potential to be something better than what you are now." He turned to face Snake directly. "You wear patches claiming territory, but you haven't earned an inch of ground. You talk about respect, but you don't know the meaning of the word. Real bikers protect their communities. They don't terrorize old folks and young waitresses." Several of Snake's gang members had removed their sunglasses, staring at the photographs with a mixture of awe and shame. Two of them, the veterans Harold had noticed earlier, had unconsciously shifted to a position of attention. "So now you have a choice to make," Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership. "You can either continue down this path, knowing that every real biker organization in the country will hear about how you treated a founding father of the Alliance." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Or you can learn what it really means to be part of the Brotherhood of Riders." The silence in the diner was absolute. Harold's revelation hung in the air like thunder before a storm. In that moment, everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would become a legend in Miller's Creek, the day an old veteran revealed he was much more than anyone had imagined. The atmosphere in May's diner had transformed completely. Snake stood frozen, still holding Harold's veteran's cap, but his grip had weakened. His face had lost all color as the full weight of his mistake became clear. The snake tattoo on his neck seemed to have lost its menace, now looking more like a scared garden snake than a deadly serpent. Two of the younger bikers, both veterans themselves, stepped forward. The taller one, who had a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, spoke first. "Colonel Matthews?" The Colonel Matthews who led the Operation Homecoming raids in '85? His voice held a mixture of awe and shame. "Sir, my dad rode with you back then. He still talks about how you helped veteran families." Harold nodded, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at the young man. "What's your name, son?" "James Wilson, sir. Did 4 years with the Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan." James removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that couldn't quite meet Harold's gaze. "If I'd known who you were." "You should show respect regardless of who I am," Harold said firmly. "The measure of a man isn't how he treats people he fears or admires, but how he treats those he thinks can't fight back." These words hit home with several of the bikers. A few removed their sunglasses, others shuffled their feet uncomfortably. The tough guy facade began cracking, revealing younger men who had lost their way. Snake tried one last time to maintain control of the situation. "Look, we didn't know," he began, but another biker cut him off. "Shut up, Snake," said a stocky rider with a Desert Storm veteran patch. "Just shut up." He turned to Harold and straightened his posture. "Colonel, I'm Mike Roberts, served in the First Gulf War. Some of us here, we're veterans too. We forgot what that means." The change in the room was almost physical. The tension that had filled the diner for weeks was transforming into something else: shame, respect, and the first glimpses of understanding. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her hand covering her mouth as she witnessed the transformation. Harold walked over to Snake, his movements steady and purposeful. "My cap, if you please." His voice was quiet, but carried unmistakable authority. Snake handed over the veteran's cap with trembling hands. As Harold took it, Snake seemed to shrink, the false confidence of a bully replaced by the reality of standing before a true leader. "The Veterans Motorcycle Alliance was founded on 3 principles," Harold said, addressing all the bikers now: honor, service, and brotherhood. "We created it because we saw young men like you heading down the wrong path. Men who needed purpose, structure, and a way to use their strength to help others instead of hurting them." James Wilson stepped forward again. "Sir, some of us, we'd like to learn, to do better." Several other bikers nodded in agreement, including most of the veterans in the group. Harold looked at them thoughtfully. "The Alliance has a chapter 30 miles from here. They run programs for homeless veterans, escort military funerals, and organize charity rides. They're always looking for new members who want to earn their way into real brotherhood." Snake's followers were now openly separating themselves from their former leader. More than half the bikers had moved to stand near James and Mike, their body language showing they'd chosen a new path. "But first," Harold continued, his voice firm, "you have some apologizing to do. To May, to Sarah, to every customer you've harassed, and to this community you've terrorized." He put his cap back on, adjusting it with the precision of a Marine. "Real respect has to be earned. Are you willing to do the work?" "Yes, sir." Several voices responded in unison. May wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. Sarah stood straighter, her fear replaced by amazement. Through the diner's windows, they could see townspeople gathering, drawn by the unusual quiet from the usually rowdy establishment. Harold turned to Snake, who still stood alone. His leadership and power evaporated in the face of true authority. "As for you," Harold said quietly, "I suggest you find another town. The days of terrorizing this community are over." Snake backed away toward the door, his remaining loyal followers falling in behind him. But most of his former gang stayed, standing at loose attention, waiting to hear what Harold would say next. They knew they were witnessing the beginning of something important. A chance for redemption, for purpose, for real brotherhood. 1 month after the confrontation at May's Diner, the morning scene had transformed completely. The parking lot now held a neat row of motorcycles, their chrome polished to mirror shine, each one parked with careful precision. Inside, the former troublemakers sat respectfully at their tables, their leather vests now bearing different patches, the prestigious emblem of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance trainee program. Harold sat at his usual corner booth, no longer at the counter. Around him, James Wilson and 5 other reformed bikers listened intently as he shared stories from his years of leadership. His coffee cup was always full, with Sarah or one of the younger riders rushing to refill it before it got half empty. "The Alliance isn't just about riding motorcycles," Harold explained, spreading jam on his toast with his usual careful precision. "It's about being there for each other and for our community. Every patch you earn represents service to others, not intimidation." May's Diner was busier than ever. Word had spread through Miller's Creek about the remarkable transformation, and people came from neighboring towns to see it for themselves. They found the once feared bikers holding doors open for elderly customers, helping carry heavy plates, and even organizing a weekly breakfast program for homeless veterans. Snake and his few remaining loyal followers had disappeared the day after Harold's revelation, never to return. The local sheriff heard they tried similar tactics in another town, but quickly left when word of their encounter with Colonel Matthews reached the local veterans group. "Remember," Harold said to his attentive audience, "respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through actions." He pointed to a new plaque on the diner's wall, a thank you letter from the town council to the reformed bikers for their community service. James Wilson, who had emerged as a natural leader among the reformed group, stood up and addressed his fellow riders. "Colonel Matthews taught us that being tough doesn't mean being cruel. Real strength is using your power to protect others." The changes went beyond the diner. The former road warriors, now proudly wearing their Alliance trainee patches, had become a positive force in Miller's Creek. They escorted elderly residents to doctor's appointments, organized motorcycle safety courses for teenagers, and started a motorcycle maintenance workshop at the local high school. Michael, Harold's grandson, no longer worried about his grandfather's safety. Instead, he brought his children to the diner on weekends, where the young ones were delighted by the bikers' stories and their gleaming motorcycles. The riders had become role models, showing the next generation what it meant to serve their community. May's business flourished. The diner became known as a place where veterans gathered, where respect was the rule, and where the coffee was always hot, and the conversation meaningful. She hung photos on the walls. Harold in his marine dress uniform, pictures from Alliance charity rides, and a group photo of the reformed bikers with their new Alliance mentors. Sarah continued her college studies, now with a scholarship established by the Alliance members. "The Colonel showed us what leadership really means," she told customers who asked about the transformation. "It's not about making people fear you. It's about inspiring them to be better." Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., Harold still arrived at the diner. But now, instead of tension and fear, he was greeted with respect and warmth. The younger riders stood when he entered, not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration. His corner booth had become a place of mentorship, where he guided these men toward a better path. The story of the 93-year-old veteran who transformed a gang of troublemakers into community heroes spread far beyond Miller's Creek. Other Veterans Motorcycle Alliance chapters began similar outreach programs, looking for young riders who needed guidance and purpose. On Harold's 94th birthday, the diner was packed with Alliance members from 3 states, all there to honor the man who had shown that it's never too late to make a difference. The party lasted all day, with stories shared, lessons learned, and promises made to continue his legacy of service. As the sun set on that celebration, Harold sat in his corner booth, surrounded by the men he had helped transform. His weathered hands held his coffee cup, and his veteran's cap sat proudly on his head. In the window's reflection, he could see not just his own face, but the faces of the next generation of riders who would carry forward his message of honor, respect, and service to others. The transformation of May's Diner had become more than just a local legend. It was a testament to the power of true leadership, the possibility of redemption, and the enduring impact of one man's quiet strength.